Hello everyone, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, good middle of the night to our friends in Australia. Um, you're back with the British region, live from our British region convention 2020. It's all been virtual this week. This is day 6, final day, and one of our penultimate activities. We have a little social event for members after this. But I'd like to introduce you to John Firth, the archivist and historian of the British region, who is going to give you a clinic on the first 75 years of the British region of the NMRA. Good evening, John.
Good evening. I hope everybody can hear. Shout if you can't. Right, in outlining the region's history, I want to first of all go through some of the events of the early years, but then rather than go through year by year and have you all falling asleep, I'll break it up and show you how various things have changed over the years. So a quick resume of how it all got started. Firstly, I'll go back way before we started to 1934. And the big issue facing model railroading was lack of interoperability. All the manufacturers of kit made things to their own standards, so you couldn't interchange. Model Railroader, Volume 1, Number 1, in January 1934, hit it quite right, that there was a need for standardization. And lo and behold, taking an example, traction voltage, some companies used 6 volts DC, some 12 volts DC, some 16 AC. We even had 115 volts AC on the track. You wouldn't have dirty wheel problems at that. And then, of course, there's the third rail, some inside, some outside, and some two rail. So you couldn't really move stuff around. So along came the NMRA, and on Labour Day 1934, it formed with the objective of developing standards for scale model railroads. Now, looking at the British modelling scene at this time, we had 2-rail and 3-rail traction voltage problems. We particularly had poor motors. I don't know whether you remember, the 3-pole motor was the norm, whereas the States, 5-pole was the norm. So that was a huge difference. And then all the other interoperability issues as well. Taking Hornby, it started off with 110 AC for propulsion, 4 volts, then 6 volts, 20 volts AC, and finally in 1938 settled on 12 volts DC, but third rail. Now again, still offering interoperability issues because Hornby didn't necessarily need to insulate their wheels. So if you tried that on a railway that had got 2 rail, you got problems. So again, we had interoperability issues. Right, so now we come to the British region. The war is going on. In 1942, Bill Bolton, he was serving in the Navy, managed to get a message out to people saying that he wanted to compile a list of people who were interested in modelling American railways. Now, what we don't know is whether he was motivated by the American prototype or just that American models worked so much better than British. That's a bit of an unknown, but anyway, he set to and got a little bit of interest going somehow or other. It must have been very restrictive in 1942, but he basically wanted to form a group, and then he liaised with the NMRA. In 1944, Larry Sadel, who was then NMRA president, agreed to cooperate with Bill Bolton's group and set him various objectives. And one of them was to collect 50 names to allow the setting up of a region, which Bill managed in 1945. So we became the British region, and so you can describe Bill Bolton as the father of the British region. So on the 2nd of September, the charter was signed. There it is. Now, the 2nd of September, on the USS Missouri, General Douglas MacArthur was involved in the Japanese instrument of surrender. Somehow or other, he was completely oblivious to the signing of this charter in America for the British region, but never mind. This went ahead, and we started off with a membership of about 330. They then sort of started putting together a list of officers pending a ballot. And strangely, the proposal for the president was one Lord Brabazon. Now, whether he actually ever did become a president, I don't know. As far as we know, an A.C. what's his name? A.C. Curtis became our first president, and never heard any more. There's nothing else about that we know about him. Anyway, come 1946, the first meeting. It was in London, and 7 attendees. Colossal event, but never mind. The other thing that started in 1946 was Highball. This was a magazine. Now, for a diverse organisation like ours, in the days before internets and telephones much, communication was very important, and so setting up this magazine was vital. Nothing else much happened in 1946, but 47, Highball had to be suspended. Membership had started off very well, but started to fall away. So for financial reasons, they suspended it. We were also having difficulties in sending money to the United States because of currency restrictions. That affected getting supplies. It was a difficult times. To add to the difficulties, Bill Bolton took up the post of transport engineer to the Gold Coast government. Now that's now Ghana. And he left the country and never heard of him again. But so it started the region, but basically that was it. The first AGM was held and numbers had rocketed to 11 attending. In November, this restarted Highball. In 1948, there was a particular group developed around Harrow in London. And they were very, very keen, dynamic, and produced a magazine called the Harrow Hoggers, which was shared with the whole of the region. Towards the end of the year, Highball resumed, but anyway, into 1949, a magazine called Roundhouse appears. In 1949, we also had what they had the third annual general meeting, which they called a convention. It wasn't much of what we would call a convention today, but it was a convention. We produced a yearbook, and this is an example of it, and that is the membership list. So you can see in 1949 we had a reasonable number of members, and if your eyesight's good, they're spread pretty well all over the country. 1950, we had what we would have the first recognisable convention. Now this involved hiring a hotel, a block booking, and so on. It was very much more like we know. It was at the Road Station Hotel in York. 104 members and their families attended. They put on quite a lot of things, nothing by today's standards, but they looked after everybody. There were activities for the ladies as well. Second yearbook was produced, and this showed 113 members and 45 in America. Of those, I don't know how people often American names, but we had John Allen, Bob Bast, Bernard Gottlieb, Al Kalmbach, Vic Ketchum, Paul Mallory, Ed Ravenscroft, Larry Segal, John Taylor, and Gordon Varney. They were all members of the region, and quite a few more. That's the membership list for 1950. 1951, we had another convention in Cheltenham, and both Bill Walters and Gordon Varney came over to this country because they were seeing the UK as being a useful market for them. 1952 saw the second York Convention, and this one was a lot more than the first, and it introduced a new concept of the Dreamliner. Now, in the States, the Dreamliner was basically a fan trip. So we had a fan trip that year. Anyway, I'll slow down on the year-by-year thing, and generally the membership of the region, it was becoming established. We had a reasonable membership. We were reasonably stable on finances. But there were setbacks. 1957 was a classic. That year, we had a supplies agent who thoughtfully ordered 24 British region ties, which committed us to a lot of money. It would have been a good thing if we'd had anything like 204 members, but we didn't, and finances got a little bit tight. The American President Eber Allen came to the rescue and suggested that we could sell these ties in the States together with region membership. So that we built up quite an American following as a result of selling them ties. We also saved money that year. We cut down on having Roundhouse printed, which I'll go into a little bit later. 1958 saw another innovation. We had a spring meeting at Chester. It was basically a half-year business meeting, but over the years that expanded, so we're starting to get more meetings than just a convention. Leaping on to 1971, we had a national convention in London, which I will cover in some detail later, but it took many years of planning, and the team was led by George Gregory and George McGee. And well, you'll hear a little bit more about that. So let's have a look now at the region magazine. That was Highball. It was printed. Now, just to remind you, the economics of printing in those days was quite expensive. The first copy cost the earth. Subsequent copies cost almost nothing, but it had to be typeset in metal. It was a real job. So come the fall in membership in 1947, that was suspended. In due course, it was replaced by about 3 copies of Harrow Hoggers. This is an extract of that. This is the September 48 issue. And then In 1949, Roundhouse appeared, and this is how it looked. It had two colours for the cover, but the picture was always the same. But again, it was all typeset, so quite expensive. In 1954, they did make a change in that the printed cover remained, but they ended up with a typed inner sheets, which reduced the price a bit. But 1957, a very major change. We took the production of Roundhouse in-house. Now, this involved the purchase of a typewriter, duplicating machine, and so on. And we cut stencils. It was printed, typed out, all done ourselves. Fred Cooper was the key man, and a number of region members loaned money to get this lot going, but it saved quite a bit. Now, that is the sort of duplicating machine we ran it on. Now, ours was a Roneo, that's a Gestetner, but I think there won't be many people able to tell the difference. And many happy hours have I stood in front, sat at a machine like that, addressing envelopes. That's an addressograph machine, and every member's had a metal plate with their name and address on it, and they were fed through and printed onto the envelopes. It was a major task, because the magazine was monthly at that stage as well. In 1960, my mother took over the actual production with the doing the production using the Roneo machine. I've spent many happy hours walking around the table, collating roundhouses, stapling them, putting them in envelopes, and so on. That was quite a thing. And the editor had to type out the wax stencils each time. It was a big job. At one stage, I was the editor, and I took it on for a year and was delighted to get rid of it, because huge job, 12 issues in a year, typing the lot, as well as getting people to send material in. It continued in this duplicated form. Steve Park was one of the producers at one stage. Then in 1983, we moved to having it printed commercially. You can see that it is still typed, but you've got a much better production. It's much clearer. For some reason or other, the E and the O of British region didn't seem to come out, but fine. By March '89, the word processors had come in, and life was an awful lot easier in being able to build up articles, amend them, made life an awful lot easier, but that was typical of what we had in 1989. Continued 2002, a bit more recognisable. And then 2003, we had our first colour issue. At first, it was only a couple of sheets of colour, and we had to make sure that anything we wanted colour ended up on those sheets. And then in due course, it became full colour. And that is what we've ended up with today. Right, so that's the magazine. Meetings and conventions. Now I'll have a look at how things have changed over the years. The first meeting was in Crouch End in London in '46, I've mentioned. First AGM 47. In 1949, an AGM that they called a convention, but wasn't really. 1950, we had a recognisable convention. Held there, that is York Royal Station Hotel. It probably won't be far off the right date. And this is what was the sort of display that they had at the convention. Strangely, looking at that picture on the right-hand side, quite a few of those cars are on this layout behind me at the moment. And that would be the sort of display we had. Everybody with their name tags. The business meeting. Well, there are the minutes of the 1947 meeting. Apart from changing the names, probably they wouldn't read a lot different to today. We need to attract more younger modelers. We should publicise activities and so on. It's all there. The business meeting itself, nothing has changed really. It's just the usual armchair, suits, ties, just normal. Other convention activities. Let's have a look at layout. Well, that was what we managed in 1953 for a layout. Now, I don't know if many people remember this particular layout. This was in the early 70s. Sorry, this was Peter Pedlow's Keddy Y and Feather River Canyon. It was quite an innovation to have a model like that at the convention. He tried lifting it, it weighed a ton, but we improved on those sort of things later. A typical scene on a Friday at a convention. An empty room being filled, marked out, chaos, and eventually things get set up. Other examples of layouts. This one is at Bristol in 2002. And that is 2014 at Bournemouth. Mm. That was down in the basement. We had a wonderful area there. The thing I remember about Bournemouth was that you went down a flight of steps and there was a low point which you could bump your head on. And there was a notice saying, "Mind your head." And it also had the message in Braille underneath, which seemed interesting. Recognise this one as Derby. This building, which we've used a few times, that well was originally built with a view to having a model railway in it. It was the Transport College, and they had a model railway there for training signalmen. So we weren't the first to get a model railway in there by quite a long way. Contests have changed over the years. In the early days, the judging was rather hit and miss. You picked the guest speaker normally to go and have a look at the models and decide which was the best, and that was it. So it was just down to the judgment of one person. It wasn't the best of ways of doing these things. But come the 1971 convention, I think that's probably when things changed a lot, because we saw the idea of having structured assessment of the models and marking in order to get them going. Anyway, but now, by 1973, we had actually appointed a contest chairman. So from then on, we've had somebody who's looked after the contests. We awarded cups for the models in various categories. That is Joe Clayton, who started this layout that's behind me. Trade. Always been vital at conventions as trade, be it members trying to sell their own items on bring and buy, and members of the trade with wonderful things to buy, auctions, in various forms. A fairly recent innovation has been modules. This is Derby, I think. Yes, I'm sure it's Derby, where because of standardization, people can bring along models comfortably, in the knowledge that it will join onto other people's. And you can build up interesting shaped layouts. It's what Tom has been the leader in this. Go to the banquet. Now, you will recall that the 1949 convention had a convention, although it was only the AGM, but it also had a banquet. That was at the Kippy round the corner. However, it became a little more formal after that. We had formal dinners, speakers. It was quite a thing. Right, I mentioned the Dreamliner. 1952, we had a special train. It went from York to Doncaster. In this up for anybody who isn't too clear on where York and Doncaster are. And that was the loco we had. Mallard, the holder of the world's speed record for steam. And call me a hoarder, but I still have the 1952 Dreamliner board in the garage. There's it on its way to Doncaster. There it's on its way back again. And when they got to Doncaster, they had a look around Doncaster Locomotive Works. And that was a picture taken on that day. An A3 and an A2 in being rebuilt. 1953, we had you might call this a Dreamliner, I don't know. I don't think they ever got to ride on it, but they had a visit to the Post Office Railway from the Charing Cross Convention. In Harrogate Convention in 1956, we hired a diesel multiple unit and went round York, Scarborough, Whitby, over the North York Moors and back. Wonderful trip. Only we could do it today. That was part of the party getting ready to travel. 1959 was another splendid do. Frank Toombs ran the Chester Convention. We'd had a diesel multiple unit from Chester round to Minford near Portmaddock, where we changed onto the Festiniog, 1 foot 11.5 inch gauge railway, and went up to what was then the limit of Tannybulk. That's the train about to leave Chester. They even went to elaborate lengths of putting the Dreamliner on the sideboards. And there is Festiniog. It's a suitable headboard. And at the top end, everybody gathered together for the classic photograph. A lot of people I recognise on there. (1962) was another remarkable one. Ellis James Robertson held Droitwich Convention, and on this occasion we hired not only a train but the Bromyard branch, and we hired an 060 steam engine and the branch, and we drove it up and down the branch for the day. everybody had a wonderful time. The press got involved. Needless to say, it was on television. There they are filming, ready to go. Film crew on the footplate. Health and safety didn't mean an awful lot in those days. That was Frank Toombs. 1973, we had our first overseas convention. Well, wasn't exactly foreign, but we got to Douglas, Isle of Man, and we had a ride on the Isle of Man steam railway down to the southern end of it. Everybody took photographs, and then we went back. We also went up the Snaefell line. Windermere, I suppose you could call this a Dreamliner, but it was very, very different. That was the main transport. And that was the other half of it, a boat. Right, you will have seen the bell in some of these pictures. 1952, British Railways carefully removed from the museum for us Royal Scott's bell from the one that Royal Scott was fitted with to go around the States. So we had this at the banquet. In 1953, we were presented with our own bell. This kit was courtesy Canadian Pacific. It came from that loco, and that is almost certainly the bell that became ours. For those who want to know, that is a Class D6B of Canadian Pacific. So we no longer had to get the Royal Scott bell removed. We had our own. It wasn't desperately convenient. However, it went on the Dreamliner with us. It got rung at every station, to the irritation of most people, I suspect. 1957, Salvation came. We were presented with a miniature bell, a third scale bell, and this came from the northeastern region of the NMRA over in the States. And that has been in the custody of the president ever since. Just a little bit easier to handle than the main bell, which now resides at Bressingham. Summer meets, these sort of developed. This one was, I think, one of the early ones at Ellis James Robertson's house in Worcester. And he threw his house open and his garden, and we had an interesting time. That is Ellis in the yellow jumpers in the middle. Now, not quite worked out what the secateurs are for. They look a little bit ominous, don't they? Brass locos were coming along. Right, 1971 convention. Before the convention, we were inspected. Ken Mortimer, president of the NMRA, came over to sort of check that we were doing things right. So here he is checking that Crouch trams work all right. He had a good drive on tram. We got a good drive on a Keighley and Worth Valley line. So he went away satisfied. That was the convention handbook, and the convention got underway in London, the centre of London. It was split over two hotels, the Mount Royal and the Moston. had two fan trips. One went down to the south of England, around various places, visited Cranley, Tilgate, Beechhurst and the Bluebell Railway. That I think is Cranley. So we introduced the Americans to British modelling. That is, I think, Beechhurst. So plenty going on there. You might notice Lynn Westcott in that picture being hauled around the layout. And Bluebell. The second trip was up to York, and we went up the west coast, narrowly avoiding Manchester, and then back down the east coast. When we got to York, they went to the then Railway Museum, not the present one, to the Minster, and to the York Museum. And we had the logistics problem. How do you get people from around those three places? We hit on the idea of using an elevated walkway. So we took them around the York walls, which was quite an experience for them. Here are some of the pictures of the contests in the 1971 convention. An array of cups. The ladies played a huge part in this, providing alternative entertainment for families, because a lot of families were over. They did a wonderful job. And we ended up, here's Mallard again in a current guise, but that is at Clapham. We went to the Clapham Railway Museum and we had a buffet so that they could pick up sandwiches and walk around at their leisure and inspect everything. Quite an event. Bernie Myers organised that. So instead of the usual banquet, it was a buffet. Right, just getting on to other things. A few people here. I don't know. This one is from 1966. It's the spring meeting. Some names that you will probably recognise. Mr. Fenton there. And picture of 30 years later, 1995, a gathering of ex-presidents. Most of those are ex-presidents, with just a few exceptions. Bob Charles, who was the NMRA president, Steve Park, who was never president, but he's done pretty well every other job going, and right over at the back, not labelled with the specs, I think that is Alan Pollock, who was the NMRA assistant president, sorry, vice president, get it right. Right, just going over a few other things in the region's history. One thing that we set up at a very early stage was a library. Information was very, very hard to come by in those days, and so having a library was really important to us. We had it ended up very large, but with the coming of the internet and so on, information became more readily available, so the importance of the library has diminished over the years. So what we've got now is quite a cut down version, and whether it will continue forever is maybe doubtful, but it certainly served its purpose at one time. Publicity from the very beginning. We've had publicity officers under various names. It was very important to the region that we had good publicity. So from 1946 onwards, we've had somebody doing that role. The achievement programme came in the 60s, and in 1964 we had a programme manager, which led to collating and getting lots of people to get achievement awards. We had a post of tape slide dispatcher. He was created in 1967 with the coming of the audio cassette. It became a convenient way to get information out for clinics, where you sent a pack of slides and an audio cassette and people could go through the presentation. By 1990, the technology was changing and the job disappeared. We found better ways of doing it, but in its time it was innovative, something that we could do. The registrar. In the earliest days, dues were looked after jointly by the treasurer and the secretary. It seemed to be chaotic, but in 1955, a registrar was created, whose sole job was to deal with getting new members, relieving them of money, and getting renewals done. The job grew, and in 1993, they ended up with creating a renewals officer, or in fact, they created 2 renewals officers. There was renewal officers A to K and L to Z. So you had to deal with the appropriate one according to your surname. The following year, it was turned into a single one, and the existence of computers revolutionized the job. Right. 2005 was a very interesting stage. The NMRA came up with a long-term plan. The idea was that any NMRA member would be a member of the region in which he resided and the division in which he resided at no additional cost. The region and the divisions were not to be allowed to make a charge. The member would pay some money to the NMRA, and the NMRA would send the region some money to cover the costs. Now, we were somewhat unhappy because this was potentially devastating. The largest part of our finances went on Roundhouse, and the amount that they were proposing to return was nothing like enough to cover Roundhouse. So negotiations were held. Eventually, things changed. British region and Australia and Canada got reduced dues. We got it for basically $9, but it acknowledged that there were many services that the NMRA offered, such as insurance, which couldn't be used in those countries. The other penalty was we became responsible for collection of the dues and all the administration work of that, just simply sending the data and the money to the States. So we became responsible for all the work. And the real breakthrough was that we were able to offer what we called region services at an additional cost, so we could keep Roundhouse. We could invite members voluntarily to pay for Roundhouse in addition to NMRA membership, which most do. So, a considerable amount of work that came to pass. Well, that about brings us up to date. The other thing was, yes, there was a trust we had a trustee up then. It was frequently the NMRA president, but we chose to have a specific person as the trustee, the liaison with America, and that was Steve Park most of the time. And anyway, that became replaced by the Atlantic director. That's when that came into being. Right, things have gone on, and now we have a virtual convention. That's another first for the history books. So that's it. I don't know whether anybody has any questions. I'll try my best to answer them.
Thank you, John. We do have some questions from the
oh dear,
folks online.
Afraid of that.
Oh no, they're not too bad questions. Not too bad at all. If we can just get my screen to. Oh well, my screen's frozen, but it's still broadcasting. Everybody's seeing everybody's face now, and out in the big wide world, which isn't what I wanted, but never mind. So the first question was, how much cooperation has there been, an exchange of ideas between NMRA North American regions and the British region over time?
Oh, well, certainly in the early days, making contact over there was vital. As I mentioned, I think people like Eber Allen, who helped us out when we had a crisis, but because NMRA members joined the region from in the US, and everybody knew addresses in those days, we were able to circulate information of who was who. People could make their own contacts, and they had people to talk to. More recently, it's become a little difficult to work out who is who in the States because they don't issue membership lists anymore. Does that answer it? I don't know.
I think so, yeah, that was great. And then there's a question which I should know the answer to. I think it's 12, but anyway, how many divisions does the British region have?
13.
Is it 13? There you go. There are 13.
Don't ask me to name them.
No, I only know my own. That was the questions from out here on the online. So thank you to everyone that's watched this live stream. Thank you for joining us at our British Region Convention. Oh, I have more questions. I was like wrapping up, but never mind. So it is an interesting one because this topic came up earlier at our members meeting, like usual. How are North American modelers and models or displays accepted at UK train shows?
I'm probably not the person to ask. I'm not a real attender of UK train shows.
No, I think I'll answer it. I think that an increasing number of North American prototype layouts with the availability and access to stuff on the internet are being seen at UK shows, and generally they're accepted. Some people then walk away and what's that American rubbish, but on the whole, it's actually probably growing a little bit at UK train shows to see stuff, not just North American, but Australian layouts from Europe and stuff. As stuff just becomes more accessible through the internet, and people have access to stuff from overseas. So anyway, I think that wraps it up. So
we certainly used to be able to make quite an impact with the reliability and quality of what we had to offer. More recently, British have caught up with the standard and models that are generally available.
We'll go to Mike Arnold.
Sorry, lost my cursor for a moment. Depends who was asking that question, Gordy. Was it one of our overseas guests? Was it?
Yes.
About about exhibitions. I think all of the big shows will have a mixture, and invariably there is some American content. there are some shows, I can't remember them offhand, but I know there were a couple of shows who steadfastly refused to have any American content in it, and it's all British. But you often find you've got most interests catered for. Yeah, there are people that turn away and aren't interested at all in American. But we were discussing this earlier on about Fremo, for example, where there's quite a lot of interest stirred up. Tom mentioned this the other night when we were talking about designing modules. That you could spend hours talking to people over the barrier if you've got a Fremo set up, because you're not operating it intensively, so you've got the time to talk to people, and often engaging them is actually the best way of addressing it. But some people, don't like American, some people don't like British, some people don't like continental. It's just the way we are. We've all got our own foibles. I hate seeing tail chasers. I prefer to see something which is done to scale and looks like the real thing. But, just personal choice, I guess.
And Terry, Wynne?
Yeah, to follow on what Mike was saying, I mean, some of the big model clubs in this country, I mean, such as the Manchester Model Railway Club, I mean, they have an American group working with them, and they're also shown at their shows. I mean, Manchester used to have this famous Christmas show, but I mean, it's moved slightly from that, but they do that. But my reason for putting my hand up before was ask John a question, and that was back in 1952. It was the intention to hold this international train show in York, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
And the programme that was made up for that, is there a copy anywhere that you know of?
I don't have one. I didn't mention it, but Bill Walters was bringing a party over to that convention, and at the last minute, that was cancelled. But the convention still went ahead and was a great success.
Yeah, I made contact, having met Stacey Walters at the Milwaukee convention, and I asked her if a copy was still available in the family's records, and she did say she would have a look, but never came back to me.
No, I've certainly not found anything.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I think we can carry on talking here in the British region. We're gonna kill the stream. We're gonna say thank you very much everyone watching around the world, and I hope that was informative and you learned a little bit of the history there. For those that are not seeing this live, we'll be popping this up on YouTube at some point in the future as a NMRAx video. There's some good history there of the British region and the NMRA in general. So I hope everyone finds something useful from it. But, thank you very much, and we will see you hopefully from the British region again sometime in the future.